Hello, and thank you guys for having us. As Drew did in his intro, he oversold us, so I fully expect to under-exceed those expectations. But we are going to talk to you about the hyper-connected supply chain. And with regards to the hyper-connected supply chain, if there's 3 takeaways from the presentation today, what we'd like you to focus on is the discussion topic is within different industries, where do we see clients having their supply chain truly become a differentiator? So when we see differentiation, it doesn't mean I built a slightly better statistical forecast model or I reduced inventory by 5 or 6%. But it is how are they leveraging their supply chain to make decisions faster and smarter than their competitors in an effort to either steal or retain market share, but at a higher price premium. Okay, so there's 3 key aspects that we'll talk throughout the presentation. 1, how do you drive to getting data-driven insights faster? And Dan will actually kick off the presentation with an extreme example of what the value of real-time data insights are. Number 2, how do you connect what is traditionally viewed as planning, so S&OP, IBP planning process, with things that have traditionally been siloed off as execution, whether that's transportation and logistics and warehousing, or real-time order execution and fulfillment. And then 3, companies who have enabled this through platforms like O9 to break down functional into silos so that one planner can make an enterprise value optimal decision, right? So less handoffs between the planning cycle and full understanding across competing functional metrics in supply chain, what is best for the enterprise. Daniel?
Thank you, Michael. And thank you guys for all being here. I appreciate it. So as Michael mentioned, I want to start out with a very extreme example of this hyper-connected supply chain. And about a couple months ago, I got the unique opportunity to attend a Formula E race. By a show of hands, has anybody been to, heard of, or been participants in that type of an event? It's single-seater electric car racing in the streets. I see one back there. How about, let me rephrase it. How about Tesla? Have you heard of a Tesla? There we go. Let's get some more hands up. Okay, there we go. Nice. So imagine combining Tesla with NASCAR, in a way, and then opening up the streets of Brooklyn, adding a 1.8-mile track, and just letting these cars run at about 130 miles an hour. It's a pretty extreme event. And behind that, unlike traditional racing on a track or fuel-powered vehicles, there's a ton of data that goes into this process. So if you think about it, when you've got a pit crew in NASCAR, you've got a 12-second tire change, you've got all sorts of fuel gauges and valuing the energy left in the car and the time and the track and the miles left. Here, it's the battery. So it's understanding the data around what's going into this battery. And in the pit, it's no longer 140 degrees and the smell of diesel. It's actually just a bunch of data scientists that kind of look like Michael and I down there. And they're cranking away through all the numbers. And what they've got going on for themselves is this model that defines exactly how long that battery is going to last. And it's critical because in this type of event, it's not a distance play, it's a time play. It's a 45-minute run, and the first person across signifies the end of the race, and everyone falls to complete the podium. So Genpact sponsors 2 cars, one driven by a guy named Sam, another by Robin, and they've gone through this 5th season of Formula E, and I was able to hang out with them for a day in Brooklyn. And can we go to the next slide? Oh, you got it. Thank you. Awesome. So what we saw, I took a few photos and I've shared them. I was not driving, so I can't take credit for the photo on the right. I wish that was me. But ideally, what we've worked with Envision Virgin Racing and us, and we've come up with a model. And it's driven by some very, very strict analytics, parameters, constraints. And as we were down there, Michael and I were talking, it really was very similar to a supply chain. And what are the decisions that are made? How are they going about these decisions in a timely fashion? The only difference in extremity, this is a 45-minute race with I think it's 14 turns in the track, about 70 seconds a lap, so you're talking a turn every 5 seconds, thousands of decisions made that the human mind cannot handle. So actually, could we go back one slide?
Nope.
We're staying where we are. Regardless, the point is the model that Genpact developed that they walked me through was the lap optimization model. And they're able to predict out 15 laps into the future in this race, exactly what will happen based on the temperature of the track, the conditions. There was a race in Bern, Switzerland where it began raining halfway through it, and then they had to immediately adapt the model. And these guys are doing it in a matter of seconds, if not milliseconds, and their operators, who in the supply chain might be a truck driver, a forklift operator, someone in planning, we've got it lucky. We've got days, weeks, months, if not years to plan it. And then these guys are having to drive a car at 130 miles an hour and then make a split-second decision that could result in a victory, a loss, or potentially destruction of their entire supply chain, aka their vehicle. So it was mind-boggling. And I posted the results from Brooklyn. So Brooklyn was race 14 in the event, and our driver, Robin Frins from Holland, came in first. His best lap was a margin of about 0.08 milliseconds. A blink of an eye is 0.2. So no human can make that type of decision-making capability without the data driving behind it. And the model that we use at Genpact specifically is targeted for both the car racing industry and Formula E, but also when we can slow things down a bit and look at the month timeline, it goes into the deepest level and flexibility of the data model that can prescribe to a supply chain to make these decisions more tangible and drive a better result. And then if you click it once more. There we go. This is where we came in overall. So the Envision Virgin Racing team came in third for the entire event, and that's because what Robin did in New York that day. Robin is a great driver, he's a great operator, but at the same time it was the data that actually drove this into a third place podium position. And in season 6, you bet we're going for second if not first. So, and that's the extreme example for you. And now Michael will talk about a little bit more in terms of how we can apply this to the
So when we were here last year at AIM 10X, right, our presentation, if you guys were here, it was somewhat of a debacle. I got on stage, we didn't have a PowerPoint, we clicked the slides and random images popped up that had nothing to do with 09 or supply chain even. But from that discussion, there were a lot of comments, and there were actually great questions. We skipped to the Q&A section very fast. And there were a lot of great questions of, hey, I'm on this transformation journey, right? I'm looking at 09, I've selected 09, but when I keep going in and we say, hey, we're doing this S&OP program, where you're gonna have this great end-to-end supply chain planning in 12 months. I keep getting asked these very tactical questions from people in my business of, when am I gonna solve this trade promotion concern? When am I gonna know if I have enough transportation capacity secured? When am I gonna know how planners in each of my regional areas or my different BU desk or my different geographies are planning the same way, right? So all the questions we got was super focused on execution. However, a lot of the journeys were sold very much on a strategy or high-level planning. So these were a bunch of questions we captured from last year. Now the good thing is most of these questions we've solved over the course of 12 months in our partnership with 09, driving deployments with their technology, right? So what we're gonna go through now is some of those capabilities and examples. So how did we get there? Right? So the reason that we sat back and we said, okay, all the questions had to do with execution. This wasn't a conference on execution. So why is that? And the reality is every aspect of your supply chain, your physical supply chain, has generally a different functional team. And that functional team has come up with their own requirements, whether it's for software, whether it's for business process, whether it's for decision governance. And as a result, they've bought 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 different visions, and each of those visions may or may not have an enabling technology behind them. If they do, they have different enabling technology data models. If they do, they typically have different KPIs in which they drive what they define as an optimal decision. As a result, what we've seen, right, is typically when a plan is generated in supply chain planning, for example, between the production and the logistics handoff, we might end up building a great plan, but we don't have the trucks there to actually pick up the material when it arrives, right? Or we build a great plan and give great feedback to the suppliers and say, hey, this is what we need 9 months out, yet somehow we still feel the need to be on the phone calling a supplier and say, where is my material? Or I have to change my production schedule the next day. But why? I gave you 12-month visibility, right? So what we identified is there needs to be a greater connection between planning and execution that is pulling in more things that cause disruption, such as external events, and you've heard about some of those references earlier today with 09, but also greater inclusion of external data systems, right? And whether that's weather patterns and how that impacts the customer buying behavior at Starbucks, whether that's a Hurricane Dorian and what that is going to do to a CPG company with regards to products in need for cleanup and for repair, or just this morning, actually, I was late to the conference because of the attacks in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, one of my big CPG clients have massive concerns now on fuel surcharge pricing. And what is that going to do to how they want to distribute products and which promotions they still want to run? Because are those promotions still going to be profitable given the impacts from a fuel standpoint? So what have companies done? Well, what has been the mindset of companies that we've seen do this successfully and start connect planning into execution? We see 6 things. One is the concept of concurrent planning, right? So I think many of you, if you're in this room, you've already bought into that idea. But the idea is that when there's any disruption, whether it's a demand, a supply, an inventory, a price change, your competitor has a factory burned down, anytime that there's a disruption, you should be able to understand the impacts across the whole network. So if your commercial organization comes to you and says, hey, we want to try to run this promotion, or we have this new NPI launch, and it's going to be expedited 3 months or delayed 3 months, within a matter of a day or less, ideally in the case of Dan, within a matter of minutes, we should understand what does that do to our production capacity, what stress does that put on our key suppliers, where do we have maybe ambient, freezer, or cold storage challenges if you have different temperature storage from a warehouse space, and be able to realistically understand, is that feasible to execute not only operationally, can I get the product there on time, but financially, what is it going to cost me? With platforms that have an extensive data model, the Enterprise Knowledge Graph of 09, we can start looking at the extended network, right? We were actually just speaking with a client a couple of hours ago where we're talking about planning out 400 to 500 stores, right? And seeing VMI inventory at all those stores, as well as an understanding tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, right? So any of you who are in the high tech space, I know you can share with me the pains a year and a half ago of getting capacitors and resistors from tier 2 suppliers, right? Because there was a global market shortage on allocation of capacitors and resistors. So how do you account for that in your supply chain and reduce the volatility? Another big aspect we talked about is network planners. So the concept of no longer having a demand planner and a supply planner and an inventory planner and then maybe a replanner and a warehouse planner and a logistical planner, but someone who either owns a brand or a product family or a subset of product families or a category, again, depending on what industry and vernacular you may use, that can understand when a demand gets consolidated, whether that's a statistical forecast, whether that's trade promotion planning, whether that's your CRM data. But once you have a bought-off demand signal, when there's any changes to that, right? Because nobody really operates on one demand signal. You operate on a demand number that has a tolerance of what could realistically happen, 20% upside, 30% downside. And when those deviations start to happen, in which most people would call forecast consumption or external market disasters, right? Then the demand planner says, okay, I realize that I'm going to overconsume by 10%, but can I actually achieve that, right? And then they say, hey, production team, can you guys drive an extra 10% volume? And the production team says, sure, here's my build schedule. They hand it to the buyers. Buyers call up suppliers. Hey, suppliers, can you fit this material in? Right? So the concept of giving the platform, enabled by 09, one user to understand when they accept that demand upside or when they get hit with that competitive pricing situation, understanding where are the bottlenecks across the supply chain before they just start handing the email off to the next team and waiting days and days to get a response. And overall, what we really see it driving is cycle time reduction. So as much as I love the S&OP process of Oliver White in 1978, that was predicated on very limited capabilities and technology. And to be honest, it was reinforced by companies like Oracle and SAP, who then built module applications that allow me to generate a stat forecast on the second Tuesday of every month, and a capacity plan on Friday, and an S&OP executive cycle the third week on Wednesday. But that's not how businesses really operate. Right? When Hurricane Dorian shifts off course and all of a sudden I need to repurpose Clorox bleach from Florida to North Carolina, I can't wait till the next Thursday, 3 weeks from now, to get the product there. Right? So those are the types of things that we're really pushing, and we're seeing our leading edge customers driving from their S&OP or from their technology platform investments like 09. Right? So it's a significant organizational shift. And the key, and from time standpoint, so the key aspect here is we really look to connect S&OP principles with S&OE requirements. So reduction of activity to calendar base. Have any of you guys ever participated in an S&OP meeting? Real quick, show of hands. And be honest, I won't take any photos, like the camera's on me, not on you. Have any of you walked out with an S&OP plan and say, there is no way we're ever gonna hit that plan? Right? We literally just spent a month, we built all these great PowerPoints, we built these Excel files. Yeah, this is a great plan. And then you walk out of me like, yeah, but there's no way. I mean, dude, that didn't even account for the yield that we had last week. Like, that product's not gonna launch for 6 months. What are we talking about? But, 3 weeks ago, we thought that was the right demand pattern, and that's the demand pattern that went into the S&OP cycle. Right? So the biggest thing we actually see, believe it or not, is we see greater adherence and participation in the S&OP process when we break down those barriers. Because they actually feel like the S&OP process is nothing more than continuous business planning that's running on a true foundation of believable and tangible S&OP execution. Right? So it doesn't feel like it's a side job that I step out of my day job once a month to go complete and build on PowerPoint. This thing does not like me. Okay. So planning and execution. We can cover that, and we got good on that. All right, so I'm skipping because we got 9 minutes. So a vision for 09, and how does 09 enable end-to-end execution? So Dan will pick us up with the role of 09 and the enterprise knowledge graph on the digital supply chain twin, and then how we can drive into execution systems.
Absolutely. So like Michael just mentioned, all these disruptions occur throughout the supply chain. It's an activity in terms of understanding how to replicate that and understand when it's going to happen and when you know that's going to happen. In the case of Hurricane Dorian, we necessarily didn't know too far advanced, but there are precise steps that can be taken. And the way to do it is to use 09 platform, especially as a digital twin, to replicate in advance. So imagine running your MRP several thousand times, understanding exactly how these scenarios are going to play out, driving the most valuable one based on your driving KPIs, so what's going to promote cash flow, what's going to promote EBITDA, whatever your goals are, using the platform to replicate it before it actually happens, getting a precise prescription of actions that can be taken to reach that new shifted goal, and then ultimately execute against it. Now, where we come in is understanding what happens when there's a change. What happens when there's disruption to that plan that already was disrupted, and the continuous flow of input from data. That's where we want to use the platform especially to keep up and break that cycle that Michael mentioned and do real-time planning utilizing the platform's power. In addition to that, there's elements of different forecast algorithms that can be applied, algorithms for capacity constraints that can also be thrown into the mix based on the business problems and the business environment at hand, as well as we've got mentioned on the top there of a feed-in for RPA and understanding how to speed up the already reduced cycle time of the workflow. This countered with the atmosphere of different technology architecture, external events, different macroeconomic data feeds, social media feeds, all that 09 applies. We don't say to take it all, but we say which ones are most important and which ones will really move the business driving needle towards success, and then use the platform to run through all the gaps first and then execute as you would normally.
Yeah, I think the key thing is we're not suggesting, just to be clear, because I know you see all these little boxes in the bottom. Let me see if this thing will work. Nope.
Next.
All those boxes in the bottom that said suppliers and warehouse and logistics, right? We're not saying that 09 becomes your TMS platform. We're not saying it becomes your WMS platform. But what we are saying is that if you have invested or are looking to invest in a leading edge advanced planning solution like 09 with a flexible data model, it allows us to say, let's plan our lane capacity, or let's plan a different lane or transportation modes and associated costs with them, right? So when I understand that I'm making an expedite decision, I understand what's the cost of that expedite decision versus the potential service level impact, right? If I have different storage or different warehouses, we can plan rough cut capacity of warehouse, and also what's the cost to rent additional warehouse space. If we have key suppliers who are consistently underperforming or not meeting their metrics, there's opportunities to integrate with their production plan or with their MES system because of the flexibility from an integration standpoint, right? And what we've seen is, initially customers are like, well, that's gonna be really tough to get my suppliers to do that. In practicality, we've never actually really seen a pushback because you're sharing better visibility ideally having better understanding of where they have challenges, and it creates efficiencies on both sides, right? So what we're seeing is think beyond just your four walls, but truly look at all the causes of volatility, right? And there's demand volatility, there's supply quality volatility, there's lead time volatility, there's transportation volatility. And if you have other functional systems in play, bring enough level of intelligence from those systems into your APS so that your advanced planning system can at least directionally tell you whether or not the plan is fully executable. Right? You still might have to check with OTD, Oracle Transportation, to make sure that you can truly build out the loads and the shells. But you should have some idea of whether or not you can achieve that before you even pass the plan down. Okay? And then what we're saying is at the end of the day, that will lead to a journey, in this vision of kind of 3 stages where you have your traditional S&OP cycle, right, where I might be able to look at service levels and 1 or 2 other KPIs. But generally, it's high-level reporting, and high-level reporting. And then Six 2 is then we start looking at optimizing profitability, right? So this is the inclusion of more KPIs associating more costs with different aspects of not only the plan and the product against the revenue, but also the execution of the plan and the product. So maybe you even say, hey, by shifting this promotion in this region or by delaying this NPI launch, here's my cost in engineering change management. Or here's the number of purchase orders out to suppliers I have to change, and I have a 5% transaction cost on each one of those, right? So dollarizing the impact of actually tangibly executing the plan. And then the last piece, right, is where we get into full integrated business planning, and that's where we actually see that there's the organizational shift in which we're truly trying to operate on a cost-to-serve model, as well as then the concept of the one network planner, where people have visibility end-to-end with a lot more financial data at their fingertips, right? So again, going back to our initial key insight at a lower level, right, that we had with the race cars, is how do I drive very real-time and poignant insights from a large amount of data? And we'll stop for questions. We're at 4 minutes. So we have 2 examples of new product introduction, but here's an example for one of the companies who's been empowered by 09. So this is a traditional as-is state for a new product introduction, right? So someone identifies that there's a potential new product. They do some internal case studies and reviews in the market, and they try to identify a product that might have been similarly launched, right? So same category, same flavor, same end consumer base, and then they manually dig out, well, what did the ramp curve look for that product? And then they try to copy it, and they say, okay, but when I launched that product, I only had 16 products in this category. Now I have 19 products. So I'm going to take like a 5% reduction. It's all very scientific, right? That was a joke, completely not scientific. And they spend a long time, and they put in this forecast, which is going to be highly accurate. And then they do an MOP run, which takes a day or 2. And then they say, okay, this is what it's going to cost on my network. And then they go and seek budgetary approval, which could take up to a week. And then they come back and they say, okay, now I want to do it. And then they finally release a PO to the supplier. They don't know if the suppliers can actually make this yet, whether it's in-house or out-of-house, but it sounds great because the marketing team said there's revenue associated with it, so they're going to start chasing the process. And then eventually they get some shipments, and then they start to see what's the actual impact across different channels. And then after it's been out for a week or 2, maybe then they'll say, okay, now I have enough data to evaluate whether the next 2 years of that forecast that was super scientific in the beginning is actually going to come to fruition. Okay? Does a lot of that sound like value-added time? Not especially, right? So, and in that whole case, right, think about the things that were not touched. Did we ever check with the logistics or the deployment team to understand whether or not we can execute the plan? Right? Did we ever realistically have enough time to look at data to see what other products might be cannibalized? Did we understand that of that cannibalization, what's my E&O risk on the raw materials I bought for the items that are now going to have cannibalized demand? Did we look at the inventory holding costs associated with the items that are being cannibalized if they're not a write-off? None of those things were taken into consideration, but I still spent 3 weeks to make that decision. Right? And now one of our clients who has made the investment and moved forward with 09, right, that decision-making process happens in under 2 days with way more intelligence with regards to the execution and the costs to make that transaction occur. We have 2 minutes for questions. Sorry. Here's one for trade promotion, just so you can look at it while questions happen.
Wow, we answered every question? All right.
When you mention digital twin, do you mean an approximation of the true supply chain, or do you actually mean a very true mirror image of the supply chain? Because it's been my experience that there's always some amount of layering that needs to be done to actually be able to execute the plan that's been generated from any tool. So when you say digital twin, do you mean a true digital twin, or mostly an approximation that needs to be buttressed with additional layers of processing?
Yeah, I wasn't able to catch the whole question, so let me give you a 15-second answer and you tell me how far off I am. When we say true digital twin, we don't mean a full representation of basically every lane and truck that's going to happen inside of a Oracle TMS or Forekites. Forekites was the transportation track and trace. We would bring that data in. The APS wouldn't replace that, but that would be a data input that we would want to consider. So is it 100% accurate? No, because there's a chance that someone that owns logistics or global trade could make some additional decisions that would change the underlying data. But in theory, the initial hypothesis is if the system says we can do it, we should be able to execute it. If the system says we're 120% out of tolerance, that's where we would need global trade to pull some miracles and get some additional trucks with some additional lanes. If we're 160% out of tolerance, we should be smart enough to know that that's not a gap we're not going to close, at least given the current logistics and freight market. So that would be where we'd start doing demand prioritization before we pass a plan over the wall that expects us to magically grow volume 160%. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly. Okay. What I meant was, let's say you could have limitations within the product, right, which would not be able to be, your real world applications might not be able to use the plan as is that's been generated, right, because of some specific limitations within the product. Mm-hmm. So those need to be done, say, externally with manual intervention.
We're still going to have communications, if that's the question, yes. So there would still be collaboration. We would, from a digital twin standpoint, we'd say, hey, this plan is going to have an issue in these production facilities, et cetera. This is the user that's responsible for that, or the owner, or here's the engineer that can optimize the production schedule on that particular line, be it back-end manufacturing and semi. So it would actually send a direct notification to that individual. Here's the problem we're seeking. Here's what we're looking to solve. So there might be times where, yes, you have to step outside of the plan parameters to understand how much fungibility you have in those parameters, and then you would have to go to the specific SMEs. But the idea would be bring that into the tool, right? So now I start to understand what is my true flexibility, what is my true fungibility in my planning parameters, so that I can continue to get more and more systematically intelligent on that data set, right, and all my guardrails and tolerances.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Question around the network planner.
Yeah.
Is that the same type of person with similar capabilities as the classical planners, or is it a completely different spaces?
Yeah.
And second question related to that, if you start with having network planners, does it impact your organization as well? Because suddenly you have one person poking into different silos, so to say.
Yep. So what we have found, and I think we've done this transition now of about 8 companies, generally less than about 30% of your current planners are really analytically inclined and digitally native enough to truly be a network planner. So what we've seen companies do to mitigate that is they start with a supply network planner who basically would use a system, because the system's generating MRP results, it's generating master production schedule, it's generating planned orders. So they would use the system to generate the end-to-end supply plan, right? Have rough cut capacity of lanes, of storage, of production, but really be focused on that aspect. And then as they've been able to obtain that, then what we see them fold in is the facilitation with the consensus demand team, right? Because the idea of the network planner is I understand all the priorities of demand. So when I have a supply shortage, I already kind of know from an organizational standpoint what I want to short, right? As opposed to call up 19 sales guys and say, hey, one of you guys are going to get shorted, who wants to do it? Which they're all going to say, not me, right? And they get a better understanding with like a data science COE of which demand signals have bias in them, so which ones are like are least risky to cut. And then the inventory strategy piece gets overrated as well. So that's how we've seen companies kind of walk into the concept of a network planner. But generally, I mean, we have a client who's actually here today. Their first network planner came out of finance, right? It wasn't supply chain at all. It was finance by trade, but was analytically thinking and understood the operation. So for our clients to do that, we have a whole network planner evaluation and planner efficiency exam, and helps grow the individuals into that role. Benefits to the organization, generally we see somewhere between a 27 and 37% reduction in planners overall. We've seen S&OP cycles go from 4 weeks down to 1 week, where they're literally running a cycle basically every day, and then even one of our clients has turned it off altogether and does what's considered a continuous business plan. Generally about 15% inventory reduction, and then there is some organizational realignment on decision making. Because if you have a bunch of network planners that own a brand and they share capacity or material, then there's basically someone who has to be an arbitrator or decision maker when those network planners can't resolve it. I think I tried to unpack as many of your questions as possible. Okay.
Network planners can be sometimes hidden right under your nose too. They could be people who are bogged down with day-to-day or inside the frozen period planning, so scheduling trucks and calling up before and asking why this hasn't been loaded yet, when in reality, if you just clear that off their plate, they've got the capacity or the skill set to handle it too.
I think Drew's giving us the hook unless there's one really great question left.
Who's got the best question?
Okay. There you go. You win.
Thank you very much, everybody.